Hello, dear friends. The soft clink of a silver spoon against a delicate teacup in that elegant Williamsburg restaurant still haunts me. It sounded like the final toll of a bell, shattering the 50 years I'd poured into a life I thought was mine. That was the moment I discovered the man I'd loved, the husband I'd built a home and a legacy with, was raising his cup to toast another woman, a younger woman carrying his child. The sting of betrayal, the weight of all those quiet sacrifices, and the fire of a long-buried anger roared to life within me. But from that heartbreak, I found the courage to rise, to reclaim my voice, and to write a new chapter for myself. This is the story of Margaret Elaine Thompson, a woman who thought she'd faded into the background, but learned it's never too late to step into the light. If you've ever felt your story was overlooked, or if you find comfort in tales of resilience and rediscovery, I invite you to sit with me for a while. Share a comment below to let me know where you're joining me from, perhaps over a cup of coffee or tea. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please consider subscribing. Your thoughts and experiences mean the world, and I'd love to hear them. Let's begin. The dining rooms of Williamsburg's finest restaurants always shimmer with a golden glow, the kind of light that softens the edges of the world, maybe to hide the exorbitant prices on the menu, or to make the bitter taste of betrayal easier to bear. That October evening, I sat across from my husband James in a corner booth at the Heritage Inn, a place we'd celebrated milestones for decades. The candle between us flickered, casting shadows on the crisp white tablecloth. I was 72, my silver hair pinned neatly, my hands folded around a silk napkin in my lap, still believing, after 50 years of marriage, that love could endure anything. Then James raised his Earl Grey teacup, his eyes crinkling with that familiar smile I'd once thought was meant only for me. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice warm, confident, smug. But he wasn't looking at me. His gaze rested on Cynthia, the young assistant he'd brought into our lives 3 years ago, now seated beside him, her chair angled just a touch too close. Cynthia laughed softly, a breathy sound that grated against my nerves. Her hand brushed his arm, casual yet deliberate, and then she turned to me, her eyes gleaming with something I couldn't yet name. Triumph, perhaps. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice steady, one hand resting gently on her belly as if cradling a trophy. The world stopped. The clatter of silverware on fine china, the murmur of a couple laughing at the next table, the faint clink of a wine bottle being poured, all dissolved into a deafening silence. My chest tightened, and I looked at James, searching for a flicker of guilt, a glance to acknowledge the woman who'd stood by him for half a century. But his eyes stayed fixed on Cynthia, filled with pride, as if she'd handed him a gift I'd never been able to give. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I felt a slow, deliberate calm settle over me, like the quiet before a storm. My hands trembled beneath the table, but my face composed itself into a smile, small, measured, the kind you muster when your heart is breaking, but your pride refuses to bend. Because I wasn't surprised. Not really. For 6 months, I'd pieced together the truth. The late-night business calls, the bank transfers to an account I didn't recognize, the text messages I'd glimpsed on his phone, where Cynthia called him Jay, with a heart emoji. I'd known, and I'd been preparing. I lifted my own teacup, the porcelain cool against my fingers. "To new beginnings," I said, my voice soft but sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. James's head snapped toward me, and for the first time in decades, I saw a crack in his smug facade, a fleeting shadow of unease. This morning, I continued, my smile unwavering, I emptied our joint accounts. I froze the business assets, and I filed for divorce. The silence that followed was absolute. The waiter, a young man with a nervous smile, stood frozen, his wine bottle tilted mid-pour. Cynthia's mouth opened slightly, her perfect composure faltering. And James, the man who'd always had an answer for everything, looked at me as if he'd never seen me before. I hope you both enjoy your new beginning, I said, folding my napkin with care and placing it beside my untouched plate. Then I stood, my movements deliberate, my spine straight. Every step I took away from that table is etched in my memory. The click of my low heels on the polished oak floor, the startled glance of the hostess as I passed, the faint aroma of rosemary and thyme from the kitchen, the small, faded stain on the burgundy carpet near the entrance. A mark I'd noticed 2 years ago during our 48th anniversary dinner, when I'd waited 45 minutes for James to arrive. His excuse as flimsy as ever. These were the fragments my mind clung to, as if they could anchor me against the tide of grief and rage threatening to pull me under. I stepped out into the cool Virginia night, the October air sharp against my skin. I wasn't the broken woman I might have been. I was awake, fiercely, painfully awake, and for the first time in 50 years, James was the one left scrambling for words. I didn't return to the colonial-style house we'd shared on the outskirts of Williamsburg, where the azalea bushes I'd planted in 1976 still bloomed each spring, their pink petals a quiet testament to my care. Instead, I drove my old Buick, Dorothy's car, inherited after her passing, to a modest motel just off Route 60. Its neon sign flickered vacancy, a beacon in the darkness, promising anonymity. I'd paid in cash that morning, and the clerk, a kind-eyed woman in her late 70s with a crocheted shawl, handed me the key without a word, her smile soft, as if she understood. In the small, tidy room, I sat on the edge of the bed, its polyester spread slightly worn, but clean. The tremors I'd held at bay finally broke free, rippling through my hands, my shoulders, my chest. My knees felt weak, my mouth dry, my heart racing as if I'd just outrun a fire. And in a way, I had. I'd escaped a life that had slowly, insidiously, been burning me alive. The phone on the nightstand buzzed, its harsh vibration jarring in the quiet. James, 5 missed calls, 2 voicemails. I ignored them. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a small velvet box, a gift from James's mother, Dorothy, given to me on my 60th birthday. Inside was a pearl ring, its luster soft but enduring, like the woman who'd worn it before me. "You're the glue, Margaret," Dorothy had said, her voice trembling with age. "You hold us all together." Dorothy had been gone 10 years, but her ring was a talisman, a reminder of the rare, unspoken bond we'd shared in a family that often felt like James's domain. Tonight, though, the ring carried a different weight. I thought of a moment years ago at a Christmas dinner in 1995. Dorothy, her cheeks flushed from a second glass of Merlot, had leaned close and whispered, "James is like his father, dear. They love themselves first, always." I'd laughed, brushing it off as nostalgia or bitterness about her late husband. Now, I saw it for what it was, a warning, delivered too late to save me from decades of blindness, but just in time to fuel my resolve. I opened the small suitcase I'd packed a week earlier, hidden in the trunk of the Buick. Inside was a manila folder labeled in my neat cursive, "Emergency Plan, Margaret Elaine Thompson." It held bank statements, company contracts, asset transfer forms, and a notarized letter from my lawyer, Harold Grayson, confirming my legal authority to enact the emergency fraud clause in the founding agreement of Thompson Realty. I'd signed those papers in 1980, back when I was a 27-year-old accountant with dreams of my own, helping James turn a small real estate venture into a regional powerhouse. I'd thought it was partnership, love, a shared future. Now, I saw it as leverage, my leverage. I opened my laptop, its screen glowing in the dim room, and checked the wire transfer one last time. The transaction was clean, executed at 8:03 a.m. that morning. The business accounts were frozen, locked under the emergency clause I'd triggered with the bank. James would wake up to find his empire, a network of properties, investments, and influence, paralyzed, untouchable without my signature. I closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the motel ceiling. It was stained, mottled with years of leaks and neglect. Nothing like the pristine crown molding of our Williamsburg home. But it was mine. This room, this moment, this choice. They belonged to me, and me alone. For the first time in decades, I felt the faint stirrings of something I'd almost forgotten. Power. The next morning, I woke before dawn, the motel's thin curtains doing little to block the gray light creeping in. I dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, my movements slow but deliberate, and drove to a storage unit on the outskirts of Richmond, where James kept decades of company records. He called it his paper graveyard, a dusty archive of invoices, contracts, and receipts from the early days of Thompson Realty. "No need to bother with it, Margaret," he'd say with a dismissive wave. "Just old junk." But I knew James never discarded anything that might still serve him. The storage facility was quiet, the only sound the hum of a distant generator. The keypad code was our anniversary, 10-04-1975. He hadn't changed it, a small oversight that felt like a gift. I slipped on a pair of cotton gloves, not for fear of leaving traces, but for the sense of detachment they gave me, as if I were handling something toxic. In a way, I was. Inside, the air was thick with the musty scent of aging paper, and I coughed, my scarf pressed briefly to my mouth. Rows of cardboard boxes loomed under the harsh fluorescent light, some labeled in James's blocky handwriting, others unmarked, their edges softened by time. I started with the nearest ones, pulling them down with care, my knees creaking as I knelt to sift through their contents. Tax records from the 1980s, land sale contracts, minutes from board meetings I'd typed myself on an old IBM typewriter. Nothing incriminating, just the mundane bones of a business I'd helped build. After an hour, I found a smaller box tucked behind a stack, labeled personal files, in a feminine script I recognized immediately. It was Cynthia's handwriting, the same looping letters from a thank you note she'd sent after I'd organized James's 70th birthday party at the country club. My stomach twisted, but I opened the box. Inside were folders, newer than the rest, their edges crisp. They contained copies of bank transfers, not from Thompson Realty's accounts, but from a personal account I'd never seen. Thousands of dollars, wired monthly, each transaction authorized by James's signature. Some were labeled consulting fees, others miscellaneous expenses. I photographed each page with my phone, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the dawning realization of how deep this betrayal ran. Then, at the bottom of the box, I found a plain manila envelope, unsealed and unlabeled. Inside was a single document, a consulting contract, dated August 2010, when Cynthia was just 25, barely out of college. It granted her a 20% equity stake in Thompson Realty in the event of the company's dissolution or the incapacitation of a founding partner. My breath caught. I'd drafted every contract for the company until 2005, when I stepped back to care for my dying mother. This document wasn't mine. And there, at the bottom, was my signature. Margaret Elaine Thompson, co-founder, forged. The M was too florid, the T slanted at an unnatural angle. I sank to the cold concrete floor, the document clutched in my gloved hands. In 2010, I'd been at my mother's bedside, reading her favorite psalms, holding her hand as she slipped away. James had been busy with the company, traveling constantly, leaving me to grieve alone. Busy, it seemed, building a future with Cynthia, not just as a fling, but as a partner in the empire I'd helped create. I stayed there for a long time, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, my mind piecing together the years I'd spent in the dark. Then I stood, gathered the documents I needed, and carefully repacked the box. As I drove back to the motel, the folder sat heavy on the passenger seat. Not just paper, but a weapon. A truth that could dismantle the lies James had built his life upon. The Virginia countryside blurred past, the golden leaves of autumn a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I grew up in a small town called New Kent, just east of Richmond, where life moved slowly, and everyone gathered at the Baptist church on Sundays. My mother, a seamstress who could turn scraps of fabric into Sunday dresses, taught me that a woman's strength lay in her patience. "Margaret," she'd say, her needle flashing in the lamplight, "men need time to find their way. You hold the home steady until they do." I took her words to heart, and for 50 years I was patient with James, believing that love meant endurance, that sacrifice was its own reward. We met in the fall of 1973 at a church social, a harvest dance under strung-up lights in the fellowship hall. James, 24 and fresh from business school, was tall, with a smile that could charm the stars from the sky. He spun me across the floor to a Glenn Miller tune, calling me the smartest woman he'd ever met. "You're going places, Margaret?" he said, and I believed him, not just for him, but for us. When we married in 1975, I was 22, an accounting major with dreams of opening my own firm. But James had a vision, a real estate company that would transform Virginia's Tidewater region. "We'll do it together," he promised, and I set my ambitions aside to help him. I balanced the books, negotiated with suppliers, hosted dinners for clients in our modest starter home, smiling through introductions as James's wife. I thought it was partnership. I thought it was love. But love, I learned, could be a heavy burden. In 1985, 10 years into our marriage, I miscarried our first child, a girl, 5 months along. The pain was physical, a hollow ache that lingered for months, but the emotional weight was heavier. James was in Atlanta, closing a deal for a new development. I didn't tell him, not wanting to pull him away from his work. I sat alone in the hospital, signing discharge papers, and buried that grief in a quiet corner of my heart, where it joined other unspoken losses. The career I'd abandoned, the friends I'd drifted from, the pieces of myself I'd given up to keep our life steady. Now, sitting in that motel room, the weight of those sacrifices pressed against me. The pearl ring glinted in its box, a reminder of Dorothy's love, but also of my blindness. I'd spent 50 years building a life for James, only to realize it had never truly been mine. 3 days after the restaurant, I walked into the Williamsburg County Courthouse, my navy wool coat buttoned against the morning chill, my hair pinned as neatly as if I were heading to a garden club meeting. But inside, I was a hurricane, fueled by a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The paperwork, divorce petition, asset freeze request, and corporate injunction, was meticulously prepared by Harold Grayson, a retired lawyer who'd known my father from their days in the Rotary Club. Harold, now 80, had a voice like gravel and eyes that missed nothing. "Margaret," he said, adjusting his bifocals, "you're doing what's right. But James is a fighter. He'll come at you hard." "I'm ready," I said, and I meant it. The clerk, a young woman with a polite smile, stamped my documents, took my ID, and handed me a receipt. Just like that, my 50-year marriage began to unravel, one legal form at a time. I stepped out into the crisp morning, the courthouse's red brick glowing in the sunlight, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with freedom. That evening, my phone rang. James. I let it go to voicemail twice before answering, my silence a challenge. "Margaret, where the hell are you?" he snapped, his voice tight with anger. "You froze the accounts? You think you can just destroy everything we built? Are you having some kind of breakdown?" I smiled, a cold, steady smile. "No, James, I'm having a breakthrough." "You can't do this," he shouted. "I've got a child on the way." "Then you'd better find a way to provide for it," I said, my voice calm but unyielding. "Because my money won't." "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "You don't know what you're doing." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, my tone dropping to a whisper. "I'm taking back my life. Every dollar, every moment, every piece of dignity I gave you. You had 50 years to value me. Now you'll learn what happens when I stop waiting." I hung up, my pulse racing, not with fear, but with a fierce, unfamiliar joy. I was no longer the Margaret who smoothed over his tempers, who smiled through his absences, who shrank to fit his world. That Margaret was gone, and the woman in her place was ready to fight. A week later, the Richmond Times-Dispatch published a front-page story. Williamsburg power couple faces bitter divorce, financial secrets surface. My photo, taken at a charity auction the previous year, was grainy but unmistakable, my smile frozen in a moment of naive trust. Beside it was James, his trademark grin now a symbol of deceit. I'd reached out to Ellen Harper, a local journalist known for her tenacity, and sent her a discreet envelope containing the evidence: the forged contract, bank transfers to Cynthia's account, receipts for first-class flights and hotel suites charged to the company. Ellen didn't just report the story. She ignited it. Her second article, Thompson Realty's House of Lies, James Thompson's Betrayal Exposed, hit like a thunderbolt. The public's curiosity turned to outrage. Former employees began to speak out, their voices amplified by Ellen's reporting. A woman who'd been James's receptionist in the 1990s revealed she'd been pressured to sign a non-disclosure agreement after discovering he'd funneled company funds to personal accounts. A former broker said Cynthia had received consulting fees for deals she'd never touched, her name added to contracts at James's insistence. The community, once charmed by James's philanthropy and charisma, turned against him. At the local diner, I overheard whispers. "Can you believe it? Poor Margaret. He always seemed too slick." The tide had shifted, and I was no longer just the scorned wife. I was a symbol of something bigger. James tried to fight back. He appeared on a local news segment, his tie perfectly knotted, his lawyer at his side. "My wife is struggling with personal issues," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "She's lashing out, and I'm heartbroken." But the public saw through him. Social media, a world I barely understood, erupted with hashtags. Number Justice for Margaret, number Thompson Lies. Cynthia vanished from the spotlight. Her Instagram, once a curated gallery of exotic vacations and designer handbags, was deleted overnight. A mutual acquaintance, a member of our church, told me Cynthia had moved to North Carolina with the baby, her dreams of wealth and influence crumbling. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth was doing its work, steady and relentless, like the James River carving its path through the Virginia soil. One chilly November morning, as I sipped chamomile tea in the motel, my phone rang. It was Arthur Finch, Dorothy's lawyer, his voice heavy with hesitation. "Margaret," he said, "there's something you need to see. I'm sending you 2 documents, Dorothy's original will and an amended version James submitted 6 weeks before her passing." The documents arrived by courier that afternoon. I sat at the motel's small desk, my hand steady as I opened the envelope. The original will, dated 2005, left me 40% of Dorothy's estate. Her beloved cottage in the Outer Banks, her collection of antique silver, and her 1965 Buick Riviera, which she'd never let James drive. "For Margaret," the will read, "who has been the heart of our family." The amended will, dated 2012, gave everything to James. The signature, Dorothy's name in a shaky, uneven scrawl, bore no resemblance to the elegant cursive of her birthday cards or the notes she'd tucked into Christmas gifts. My throat tightened. I remembered visiting Dorothy in the hospital, just weeks before she died. She'd been frail, but lucid, her grip surprisingly strong as she squeezed my hand. "You're the steady one, Margaret," she'd said. "James doesn't deserve you." I'd thought it was the pain medication talking. Now I knew it was the truth. James had held power of attorney, medical, financial, everything. He'd used it to rewrite his mother's wishes, to erase me from her legacy, just as he'd erased me from his life. I called Arthur back, my voice calm but firm. "This isn't her signature." He sighed, long and weary. "I agree, Margaret, but proving it now would mean years of litigation. James has a team of lawyers, and the statute of limitations is against us." I hung up, and for the first time in months, I let myself cry. Not for James, but for Dorothy. She'd loved me like a daughter, sending me handwritten cards every birthday, teaching me her recipe for pecan pie, calling me her girl in a way my own mother never had. And James had stolen that love, twisted it to serve his greed. But as the tears dried, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about justice. For Dorothy, for me, for every woman whose trust had been used against her. I wiped my face, straightened my shoulders, and began to plan my next move. By the fall of 2025, I'd left the motel for a small apartment in Richmond, its large windows overlooking the James River. The space was simple, but mine. A solid oak dining table I'd chosen at a local antique shop, a set of blue ceramic dishes from a nearby potter, an armchair where I could sit with a book or my knitting, watching the sunset paint the water gold. There were no more formal dinners for James's clients, no more nights waiting for him to come home with excuses. Just me, and a quiet that felt less like loneliness and more like peace. I joined a senior women's group at the Richmond Community Center, a cozy space where we gathered over coffee and shared stories of our lives. There was Ruth, 78, who'd lost her husband to cancer and found purpose in volunteering. Evelyn, 82, who still tended her rose garden with arthritic hands, and Clara, 75, who'd raised 5 children alone after her husband left her in the 1970s. They welcomed me with warmth, their laughter and wisdom a balm to my wounded heart. One afternoon, as we sat knitting scarves for a church charity drive, Ruth took my hand, her grip firm despite her age. "Margaret," she said, her eyes bright, "you're our hero. You've shown us it's never too late to stand up to say enough. We're proud of you." I blinked back tears, my throat tight. "I'm no hero," I said softly. "I'm just a woman who got tired of being invisible." But their words stayed with me, planting a seed. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for them, for every woman who'd been overlooked, underestimated, or erased. In the spring of 2026, I published my memoir, The Woman Nobody Remembered. It wasn't just my story. It was Dorothy's, Ruth's, Evelyn's, Clara's, and every woman who'd been told her time had passed. Her voice no longer mattered. I wrote it over 6 months, in the quiet hours before dawn, pouring my pain, my clarity, and my hard-won strength onto the page. Each chapter was a reckoning, a refusal to let my life be defined by James's lies. The book sold out on Amazon within 3 days. Letters began to arrive, first a trickle, then a flood, from strangers across the country. A woman in Ohio wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to leave my abusive husband after 40 years. A retired teacher in Florida said, "I saw myself in you, Margaret. Thank you for reminding me I'm still here." A man in Pennsylvania, his handwriting shaky, confessed, "I was like James once. Your book made me see the hurt I caused." James sent a cease and desist letter through his lawyer, accusing me of defamation and weaponizing an emotional narrative. I posted the letter on my website, unedited, with a single caption, "This is what silence looks like when it's afraid." The response was electric. The hashtag #, We See Margaret trended for 3 days, shared by women and men, young and old, who saw in my story a call to truth. I didn't start the movement, but it found me, and I carried it with gratitude. James's world collapsed. His clients pulled out. His speaking engagements were canceled. His name became a cautionary tale in boardrooms and book clubs. Cynthia stayed silent, her brief attempt at a sympathetic blog post drowned out by public scorn. Last I heard, she was living quietly in North Carolina, raising her child far from the spotlight she'd once craved. I didn't hate her. I didn't need to. Hate ties you to the past, and I was finally free. On a clear April morning in 2027, I stood by the James River, the breeze tugging gently at my silver hair, now worn loose instead of pinned. 52 years ago, James and I had celebrated our first anniversary at a little seafood diner just up the road, laughing over crab cakes and cheap wine. I'd worn a necklace he'd given me, not knowing he'd charged it to a company card. Today, I wore no jewelry, no makeup, no pretense, just myself at 74, standing taller than I ever had. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A voicemail from my publisher, Andrea. "Margaret, The Woman Nobody Remembered is still climbing the charts. We'd love to talk about a second book, maybe a series on women reclaiming their lives. Are you open to it?" I smiled, not just for the offer, but for the realization that I was seen, truly seen. Not as James's wife, not as a shadow, but as Margaret Elaine Thompson, a woman with a story worth telling. I turned, walking along the river path, the crunch of gravel under my shoes a steady rhythm. The water sparkled, its surface catching the morning light, and for the first time in decades, I felt unburdened. James was a memory, a lesson, not a chain. Cynthia was a footnote, her choices her own to carry. And I was the author of my future. Each step felt lighter, each breath deeper. I thought of Dorothy, of her pearl ring still tucked safely in its box, a reminder that love, true love, endures beyond betrayal. I thought of Ruth, Evelyn, and Clara, their faces bright with pride at our last meeting. I thought of the letters, the voices of strangers who'd become kin through shared stories. And I thought of myself, not the Margaret who'd apologized for taking up space, who'd measured her worth by someone else's approval, but the Margaret who'd walked through fire and emerged whole. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and please share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what this story meant to you. Your voice matters, and I can't wait to connect with you all.